Charles II, the merry monarch, the king who brought the very idea of kingship back to Britain. He brought back colour, music, and laughter. Playhouses returned, Christmas was celebrated once more, and the grey, cold, forbidding Cromwellian regime was left behind. But do not be deceived, for Charles II was just as devious, deceitful, and two-faced as his father, the beheaded Charles I. In this episode, the king will risk plunging the country into civil war with his underground secret Treaty of Dover. He will use his son, our hero, the Duke of Monmouth, in these seedy negotiations. Will king, duke, and country survive? Let's take a look.
Despite the relentless back and forth of victory and defeat, of triumph and tragedy, both nations in the Second Anglo-Dutch War could not go on. England could not afford to keep re-equipping the fleet, whilst the Dutch had more pressing concerns with the ever-growing threat of a resurgent France. The Dutch were worried over the menacing aggression of Louis XIV. Having ended her internal conflicts and her bloody civil wars, her son king was now determined to focus his country's huge manpower and resources. France would soon become the great, domineering, powerful presence that looked to crush and coerce all about them. Some countries were looking for war, whilst others were looking for peace. The possibility of another European catastrophe was huge. One of the kings who was looking for peace was Charles II. The Dutch wars were crippling the economy, and the humiliation of the Dutch raid on the Medway had reduced his popularity to an all-time low. Yet despite the difficulties and risks involved in wartime peace negotiations, the king thought it sensible to include his son, the Duke of Monmouth, in these crucial talks. Monmouth, still only a teenager, was now an entitled, spoiled and bejewelled courtier, and was about to be plunged into the festering, seedy world of international politics and double dealings. The real cause of these panicked negotiations was the death of King Philip IV, Louis XIV's father-in-law. On hearing the news, Louis claimed the rights of Spain in the Spanish Netherlands should devolve to the Queen of France. Louis, the man of action, acted immediately and sent Turenne on the offensive. By May 1668, he had captured 5 frontier fortress towns. De Witt, the Grand Pensioner of the Netherlands, could see that his country would be next, and so sought a rapid peace with England. Charles II was content to send Sir William Temple as his peace envoy, and what came out of the negotiations was an offensive-defensive treaty with Holland, Sweden and Britain. This was to become known as the Triple Alliance. Louis in response pulled out of the Franche-Comté, which he had least claim to, but he was enraged to hear of the Dutch and their new alliance. He immediately scrapped the Franco-Dutch treaty and bawled, he shouldn't be threatened by a paltry republic of heretical merchants. The Netherlands was soon to be Louis's next target, but the Sun King did not just want to crush his recent allies, he wanted England at his side at the same time. For he saw Charles as the perfect king to return England away from heresy and back into the arms of the Catholic Church. Now it may seem strange why Louis thought England would ally themselves with a Catholic nation. Yes, England had fought 2 recent wars against the Protestant Dutch, but at this period of the 17th century, Protestant countries needed to stick together. The Protestant nations of Europe were finding themselves isolated and surrounded by powerful Catholic countries. The wars of religion in Europe were by no means over. To make matters more complicated, Charles was attracted to France, more than to the Dutch. He himself was half French. His mother, Henrietta Maria, was French. He had been received by the French when he had been forced into exile during the English Civil War. He appreciated the culture, the deference to monarchy. He envied the king's authority, his immense wealth, and his complete authority over people and parliament. So perhaps it would not take too much convincing from Louis to convert Charles to Catholicism, and Louis had some tempting morsels for the cash-strapped King of England. Louis could promise his help in destroying the Dutch fleet that the English could just not overcome, despite many bloody battles. Louis could offer the French navy in getting rid of Dutch trade as well as Dutch colonies. They could be shared by England and France. On top of all this, Louis would share part of the Netherlands with England, as well as assisting Charles in bringing Catholicism back to England, not to mention vast amounts of money. Money, that glittering prize, would mean Charles would not have to rely on Parliament for his wants, like his father had been forced to do. Yet Charles had to tread carefully. England was vehemently anti-Catholic. Any mention or mere hint of a resurgence in the old religion would bring out the mob with cries of "no popery, no slavery." And the problem for Charles, France was seen as the very representation of all that should be feared. Catholic, an absolute monarchy, slavery, arbitrary rule, a return to the times of the Spanish Armada, Jesuit priests, the Gunpowder Plot, and the massacres in Ireland of 1641. To get the English to agree to an alliance with France would be difficult enough. If they found out that their king had gone behind their back to secretly convert England back to Rome, civil war could easily have erupted, or Charles would have found himself, like his father, on the scaffold, another victim of regicide. So what exactly was proposed in this secret Treaty of Dover between King Louis and King Charles? It required that Charles would convert to the Catholic Church, as well as assist the French king in his war against the Dutch, to the sum of 60 warships and 4,000 soldiers. In return for this, Louis would secretly send an annual subsidy of £230,000, as well as more when Charles publicised his own conversion. To counter the expected uproar from this, Louis would send 6,000 troops to assist the English king. This treaty would be signed by a cabal, but the religious clauses would be kept between the two monarchs. This cabal, named after the surnames of the 5 men in the king's cabinet, were made up of Clifford, Arlington, Buckingham, Ashley, and Lauderdale. They were ignorant of the Catholic machinations of their monarch, and were to be the public face of the treaty. The secret part was to be entrusted to a special messenger, a person both monarchs could trust. This secret agent turned out to be Charles's younger sister, Henrietta. Henrietta, the Duchess of Orleans, was to be the go-between between the two monarchs, and the go-between for Henrietta and Charles was to be the Duke of Monmouth. Monmouth, who was still only 19, was already yearning for more action and adventure, and perhaps being a courier for the king didn't hold too much excitement for him. And yet he went and was given the send-off befitting a Prince of Wales. An under-secretary described the event. The Duke of Monmouth was received by the train band company, and firing all their great guns, he set sail on board the Duke of York's yacht for Dieppe. The 17 horses sent as a present for the French king have also sailed. Here again we see, despite the king's double dealing with his parliament and people, he was still sharing genuine concern for his beloved son. He wrote ahead to his sister, "I believe you may easily guess I am something concerned for this bearer, James, and therefore I put him into your hands to be directed by you in all things, and pray us set authority over him, as you ought to do in kindness to me, which is all I shall say to you at this time, for I think he will not be so soon at Paris as supposed." Charles wanted his son to be respected in France as his firstborn, illegitimate or not, and for him to be polished, as he himself had been, by the French court. Yet Charles should have had no fears, for Monmouth was everything Henrietta's husband was not. She greeted Monmouth as though he was a gift from heaven. Monmouth was handsome, generous, easygoing, and championed many manly pursuits. The Duke of Orleans was mean, effeminate, and vicious. Orleans had been brought up in the company of women who would encourage his effeminacy. He wore dresses, jewels, and earrings. All this so he would not be a rival to the young Louis XIV. The complete absence of love in the marriage was not helped by the Duke's brazen homosexuality. A French noble wrote, "One could not have known the Duke of Monmouth and refused to praise him. He was of all men of fashion the best made. In his face was a character and grandeur such as was worthy of his birth." Aunt and nephew were happy in each other's company, dancing, hunting, and riding. Fêtes were held, and dances were organised where she taught him the ways of the French court, and he showed her the movements of English dances. They also talked of politics and intrigue, how the disasters of the plague, the fire, had given a boost to anti-Catholic sentiment. And yet, despite the gaiety of the French court and the cheering and admiring crowds, Monmouth was beginning to chafe at her lack of action. The spark which had been ignited in him fighting with his uncle on board his flagship, and his duties during the Dutch raid, would not be put out. With fighting still raging in the Spanish Netherlands, he applied to join the French army fighting there. Unfortunately, for diplomatic reasons, his aunt, the Duchess, prevented it. The king sent his gratitude to his sister and wrote, "I give you 1,000 thanks for the care you take beforehand of James. I will answer for him that he will be very obedient in all your commands, and your goodness to him obliges me as much as is possible, for I do confess I love him very well." A few days later, another royal message crossed the Channel. Charles wrote, "I cannot thank you enough for your goodness and kindness to James. His letter to me is almost nothing else but telling me how much he is obliged to you and the Duke for your care of him. And since you have taken the trouble of lodging him at the Palais Royal, I am sure he cannot be better. I am very glad you have put the thought of going to the army out of his head, for it were not proper that he should appear in the army, now that I am a mediator by the treaty I have lately made with Holland." Charles appears extremely busy managing his family and political difficulties at the same time. His writing to his sister appears prolific. 10 days later, he again wrote to Henrietta, "I cannot thank you enough for your kindness to James. I hope he is sensible of your goodness to him, as I am. I do not tend to call him away from you, except the Duke should go to the army, but in that case, I think it will not be decent for him to stay in Paris, when everybody will be in the field. And of the other side as matters stand, it will not be convenient for me that he should go to the army, for divers reasons, which I will not trouble you in this letter." Yet as Monmouth continued in France away from any action, his wife Anna, the Duchess of Monmouth, had slipped on a ballroom floor and dislocated her hip. The pain and discomfort in an age of barber surgeons and court physicians must have been intense. On hearing the news, Monmouth sailed for home immediately. His sudden return, however, did not please the Duchess, who had hosted him these past few months, for Monmouth had not written a thank you letter. The king wrote to his sister, "I ask your pardon for forgetting to deliver your message to James, but I have done it now, and he shall answer for himself, and I am sure he has no excuse. For I have often put him in mind to acknowledge on such occasions the great obligation he has to you for your goodness to him, which I assure he expresses every day here." The king added tongue-in-cheek, "If he does fail in writing, I fear he takes a little after his father." But Charles, it seems, was diligent in his letter writing and his communications with his younger sister. He kept her up to date with the state of the Duke of Monmouth's painful hip. His letter reads, "I have been in great trouble for James his wife, her thigh being as we thought set well for 3 days together. At last we found it was still out, so that the day before yesterday it was set with all the torture imaginable." We must for a moment give some sympathy to the Duchess of Monmouth, a young girl in the era before anaesthetic or modern painkillers. Having her hip put in and out of joint in the hands of 17th century physicians, it's enough to turn your stomach. But despite his young wife's agonised sufferings, Monmouth still had his eyes glued on military command. Courtly and homely life could and would wait. The king was in agreement as well, for as well received as Monmouth had been at the French court, Charles knew that his son's future was the army. He therefore set about in procuring the command which Monmouth craved. A certain Lord Gerard, commander of the household cavalry, the most lucrative and influential colonelcy in the country, had got himself in trouble. Gerard had distinguished himself during the civil wars, and while serving as gentleman of the bedchamber during the king's exile, had begun to fashion the lifeguards on the patterns of the French king's maison de roi. But in recent years, Gerard had begun to neglect his role, and the whole reputation of this elite unit had been muddied by corruption and incompetence. One guardsman complained, "The guards will soon be full of tinkers, robbers and hackney coachmen, for however stout, well-born or loyal a man will be, he will not get in unless he has money to give the officers." This appointment was not only the command of a unit of men, but it was responsible for the monarch's security, his bodyguard which provided sentries, and escorts for the king, royal family, and his places of residence. It was unique, as none but gentlemen of good birth and education were allowed in. It was a tradition with the corps that even lowly troopers were addressed as private gentlemen. On the 16th of September, having purchased a commission for his son, the king held a grand review in Hyde Park. Monmouth dazzled. He was resplendent on a black household charger, seated on a magnificent purple velvet saddle, embroidered with gold and silver, encircling the initial M. On top of all this finery and pomp and ceremony, the king himself conducted Monmouth at the head of the parade. One might think that having a huge number of soldiers on display in the capital might have brought back painful memories of Cromwell and the rule of the major generals. But it seems not. The unusual sight of 500 scarlet-coated, ostrich-plumed cavaliers, with back and breastplates gleaming, with the king's favourites at their head, along with the foot guards on parade as well, provoked huge admiration and interest. Samuel Pepys was, of course, on hand. When I come to St. James, I find the Duke of York gone with the king, to see the muster of the guards in Hyde Park, and their colonel, the Duke of Monmouth, to take his command this day of the King's Lifeguards, by surrender of my Lord Gerard. So I take a hackney coach and saw it all, and indeed it was mighty noble, and their firing mighty fine, and the Duke of Monmouth in mighty rich clothes. But the well-ordering of the men I understand not. Here among 1,000 coaches that were there, Mr. Wren hunts me out. The capital were right to be awed by this sight, for the lifeguards were policemen as well as soldiers. They were to protect the king and his honour across all his kingdoms, and through this corps Monmouth would wield real power which would only grow for a decade. But unlike his predecessor, he took his new coveted role very seriously. An example of this is one of the first reports from the summer of 1670. I have taken an account of the arms of my troop, and find that of 200 backs, breasts and pots, 50 are wanting, whereof 14 were lost, some at the fire at the Horse Guards, and others in service at Winscombe. I begged for their supply, and for 200 carbines promised by His Majesty to the troop. A few weeks later, he was again writing, His Majesty having given order that 200 carbines should be supplied to the Ordnance Office for the use of my troop of guards, I desire that he be moved for their delivery to Mr. Barker. Also, 200 belts, straps and sockets, and a waggon to carry them. With his military career blossoming, Monmouth still kept a beady eye on his political career, and in particular his standing within the royal family, and his possible place in the line of succession. It seemed he would take inspiration from very strange quarters. While in France, Monmouth had made friends with a Theatine priest named Prenani. Prenani had a talent for fortune-telling, and was the rage of the French court. Whilst together, Prenani cast Monmouth's horoscope, and it would appear Monmouth was extremely happy with it. So happy that not only did Monmouth speak enthusiastically about Prenani to his father, but urged him to invite him to England. Louis XIV was a supporter of this move, and was convinced that Prenani could be used to impress upon Charles as to the real benefits of an Anglo-French alliance against the Dutch. But it would seem Charles was less gullible than his son, and gave little credit to such kind of cattle. To support his belief, the king wrote to Lady Castlemaine, I came from Newmarket the day before yesterday, where we had as fine weather as we could wish, which added much both to the horse matches as well as the hunting. The Abbot Prenani was there most of the time, and I believe will give you some account of it. But not that he lost his money upon the confidence that the stars could tell which horse would win, for he had the ill luck to foretell 3 times wrong together, and James believed him so much as he lost his money upon the same score. It may seem difficult to believe in our modern lives of science and evidence that men would put so much belief into superstition. Yet to Monmouth, a man who had promised to kill any man who said his father was not married to his mother, the realm of predestination must have pressed hard. He must have been assailed daily with questions such as, who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? And perhaps more importantly, will I be king? For was he not the king's eldest son? Was he not showered with titles and honours by the king? Was he not the Prince of Wales, only lacking the true legitimacy to that position? Of course, the king did not help in these matters of Monmouth's dreams and ambitions. The king indulged and spoiled his son more than any of his mistresses. By 1669, when Monmouth was still only 20, he held the positions of Lord Lieutenant of the East Riding of Yorkshire, Colonel of the Life Guard of Horse, Vice-Chancellor of the University of Cambridge, and he was a Knight of the Garter. But even now, he still craved for more, perhaps the highest title in the kingdom. For after all, hadn't Pranani prophesied it? And yet, whilst these supernatural meanderings were going on, the wars of religion were still bubbling just beneath the surface. During Pranani's visit in 1669, the king revealed to his brother, the Duke of York, Lords Arlington and Arundel, and Sir Thomas Clifford, that he was intending to convert to the Catholic Church. Charles revealed his plan for bringing them together, to discuss the ways and methods fittest for the settling of the Catholic religion in his kingdoms, and to consider of the time most proper to declare himself. York recorded, "This he spoke with great earnestness, and even with tears in his eyes, and that they were to go about it as wise men and good Catholics ought to do." To James, Duke of York, the heir to the throne, this pledge by his brother must have been music to his ears, for very soon he himself would declare his conversion to Rome. This was the point where Charles and James's sister Henrietta was brought in, to the secret clauses of the Treaty of Dover. But even before she was to travel to England to secure the secrets hatched by Charles and Louis, Henrietta's jealous husband tried to prevent her from travelling. Jealous and suspicious of Monmouth's relationship with her, he demanded that if his wife was to travel to England, then Monmouth must be banished to Holland until the talks had been completed. Louis, the great Sun King, put his regal foot down, and mediated in the matter. Monmouth would not be banished, and the talks would take place at Dover, and no more than a mile inland. Overruled by the king, Henrietta's husband was forced to let his wife travel, and before long she was met off the English coast by Prince Rupert and the Duke of York. The next few days were spent in entertainment, frivolity and celebrations. We do not know if anything happened between the king's sister and his son, but Monmouth was the life and soul of the party. There is a remarkable story of the young colonel of Life Guards teasing the French by unbuckling his sword and hooking it onto the waist of one of the actors. The play's producer John Downes recalls, "This play, The Impertinence, had wonderful success when our company was commanded to Dover. The French court wearing their excessive short lace coats. Mr. Noakes having at that time one shorter than the French fashion, to act Sir Adelin, the Duke of Monmouth gave Mr. Noakes his sword and belt from his side, and buckled it on himself, on purpose to ape the French. Mr. Noakes looked more like a dressed-up ape than a Sir Arthur, which upon his first entrance upon the stage put the king and court into excessive laughter, at which the French looked very chagrined to see themselves aped by such a buffoon as Sir Arthur. Mr. Noakes kept the Duke's sword to his dying day." But while these festivities were going on, seedier, dirtier, and more treacherous dealings were being done. The secret clause of the treaty was being signed by both Charles and Louis, the clause where Charles would bring England back to the Catholic Church. Both kings had bargained and haggled hard. Charles would get his £200,000 for bringing the Church of Rome back to England, and £300,000 annually for allying himself to France in its war against Holland. In December, the alternative treaty was signed in the open by Charles's cabal. The terms were exactly the same, without the obvious clause of a change of England's religion. The people and government of England were not to discover the secret clause of the treaty in Charles's lifetime, but the treaty was to leave a sad impression almost before it had been signed. For within a month of the treaty being signed, Charles's favourite sister Henrietta, the messenger who was privy to the secret clause, died. Paris gossip was rife, and Henrietta's husband, the Duke of Orleans, was the principal suspect. Rumour said that the Duke had poisoned his wife on her return, as he believed she had been unfaithful with the Duke of Monmouth, her nephew. Gossip and scandal swept across the Channel following the death of the Duchess. Sir John Reresby stoked the flames of suspicion and scandal. He wrote, "It was said that she was in love with the Duke of Monmouth while at Dover, and things had been so represented to the Duke, her husband, that she died very suddenly after her return to Paris, and not without serious suspicion of having been poisoned." King Charles, her brother, was inconsolable at the news, which cast a dark cloud over the plans of the Treaty of Dover. Without any real evidence, Charles could only rage in private. He bellowed, "Monsieur the Duke is a villain, but I beg you, Sir Thomas, do not say a word of it." Having fumed, he returned to his bed to mourn, and it would be several days before he appeared in public again. But before we close this shameful chapter on King Charles II and the Duke of Monmouth, we must mention who this mysterious Sir Thomas was, to whom the King had just spoken to. Like the Earl of Feversham during the Great Fire, mentioned in our previous episode, Sir Thomas would reappear in Monmouth's life. Sir Thomas was a former member of the Sealed Knot. No, not the English Civil War reenactment group of modern times, but an underground royalist group who plotted for the return of Charles when he was in exile during the 1650s. Sir Thomas was a captain in the Earl of Oxford's regiment of horse, and in the future would hold a strong influence over Monmouth, an influence that would ultimately lead to tragedy. If you missed our last episode on the Duke of Monmouth and how he battled and survived the Great Plague, the Great Fire, and the Dutch raid on the Medway, click here. In our next episode, Monmouth's dazzling career becomes sullied and tarnished as he is labelled with the terrible crime of murder. Can his father the king save him? As always, thanks for watching.